genuinely speaking, it's important to go deep on a multipolar scenario where actually there are very different mechanisms in play and different models that are actually very well progressed by now that are going to have different outcomes. Because just like when the modern energy industry was being founded in the 1890s, tomorrow's energy industry is being founded in the 2020s, and nobody knows what the ultimate outcome is going to look like in the big picture, but it's going to be probably one of the iterations being formulated right now in one of the countries we've been talking about.
Welcome to Smarter Markets, a weekly podcast featuring the icons and entrepreneurs of technology, commodities, and finance, ranting on the inadequacies of our systems and riffing on ideas for how to solve them. Together, we examine the questions: are we facing a crisis of information or a crisis of trust? And will building smarter markets be the antidote? This episode is brought to you in part by Abaxx Exchange, bringing better price discovery and risk management tools to navigate today's commodities markets through centrally cleared, physically deliverable futures contracts in energy, environmental, battery materials, and precious metals markets. Smarter markets are here.
Welcome to our Smarter Markets Holiday Special 2025, the Year in Review. I'm Dave Greeley, Chief Economist at Abaxx Technologies. 2025 has been a big year full of big months here at Abaxx and at Smarter Markets, and we're closing out 2025 by revisiting the conversations with our guests that helped us understand and articulate the themes that would come to define the year. 2025 was the year in which we discovered that this was not the energy transition that we were expecting, the year in which a new geopolitical reality emerged and old geopolitical concerns resurfaced. It was the year featuring a tale of two carbon markets and the need for new weather markets to manage the risks posed by reliance on renewable power. And finally, 2025 was the year in which there was both a new gold rush and a rush into tokenization. We hope you'll sit back, relax, and enjoy our 2025 Year in Review. Andy Home, Senior Metals Columnist, Thomson Reuters. I was thinking you're just the person to help me get my head on straight, thinking about the year to come and where we are in the battery metal space and where we might be going. And I remember the last time you were here with us on the podcast, you said something that stuck with me. You said that the energy transition hasn't stopped, but it just hasn't gone the way people thought it would go. And in this podcast series where we're discussing the state of play in the battery metals markets, I thought that would be the perfect place for us to pick up the conversation.
Let's take a little step back. Let's look at, what's been going on in these markets for the last 4 or 5 years. So 2021, 2022, it was a rip-roaring bull market. Do you remember? Cobalt, nickel, lithium, they were all going absolute gangbusters. Everyone was super excited about the EV revolution and, the exponential demand growth forecast that we were all looking at. Okay, each one of them crashed in 2022, 2023. Nickel started it, cobalt followed, lithium was last, right? We're back to sort of like where we were. But here's what happened in 2024. Nothing. They just kept on grinding steadily lower. You're getting into absolute producer pain levels, right? So we've got an industry that just 3 or 4 years ago, it was kind of like me trying to expand capacity like there was no tomorrow. We were told that the world was going to run out of this stuff. This last year, you had just seen a string of casualties, right? Plants have been closed, new mines have been mothballed. Everyone's sort of like pushed back any sort of investment plans. So this is a very, very difficult market for anyone trying to sort of like get into the battery metals business. It's a difficult market for those already in the battery metals business, right? And at the moment, we're just still waiting, as we were all last year, any signs of recovery.
And when you look at it, part of what's made it so brutal, that might be a little bit of a Western perspective in a way, right? Because so much of the production that's been coming on has been coming out of China. So much of the demand for electric vehicles and batteries has been coming out of China. How has China's growth and dominance really affected the whole balance of the industry?
One of the answers behind why the price crash is, of course, overproduction, right? The world has simply produced too much of these metals at a time when demand maybe wasn't quite where we expected it to be. Then let's run through them. Who dominates sort of cobalt production in the world? Chinese producers operating out of the Democratic Republic of Congo, right? Who dominates lithium production and lithium processing? We know the answer to that. We could say in nickels, maybe slightly different because it all comes from Indonesia, but who operates the Indonesian mines and plants? It's the Chinese, right? These guys are sort of like, have basically carried on expanding even as everyone else has had a problem, right? But hey, the whole point here is the West is running 10 to 15 years behind the Chinese. We in the West have been playing catch up ever since. And we still are, by the way.
Turning to the other side of the supply chain, you had brought up that for a long time, U.S. producers, the trouble with opening a new mine was often permitting and getting the approvals. Now you bring up it's not only the permitting, it's the price. What does that mean for Western producers? Where do we go from here? I know you wrote in a recent article that much of the production in the U.S. has been focused more on scrap than, say, new mines. What's the role for kind of new mine production outside of China and these areas where China is very embedded?
Well, I mean, I think the answer is pretty straightforward. Either we all buy really nice, cheap, very good Chinese electric vehicles and watch our domestic automotive industries die, probably quite suddenly, or we have to do it ourselves, right, in Western markets. And you can't do it without new mines. And that's just a reality. I mean, there's lots of really interesting developments going on the battery recycling side. But, bear in mind, you need a good pool of electric vehicles to have enough batteries to recycle in the first place. So mines, if you do not want to rely on China, you're going to have to build them. Building them in the States, tricky. We know the problems with the mining laws there and how long it can take to get any mines up and running. Mines in friendly countries, such as Canada. I don't know whether you still count Canada as a friendly country under the new administration, or some of the South American countries. Yes, I mean, if you do not want to allow the Chinese to dominate the electric vehicle market, new mines and new supply chains must be built out. It is difficult, though, isn't it, if prices are bombed out at sort of multi-year low prices? Who wants to lend finance to that sort of proposition? I think the US has quite correctly seen a lot of federal investment directly and through loan organizations. And to some extent, you could say, well, that's also taking a leaf out of the Chinese book, isn't it?
Andrea Hodder, special correspondent, Fast Markets.
It's interesting. In terms of China, the Biden administration had already banned Chinese hardware and software from being used in the US in cars. And he also had imposed 100% tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles and denied that $7,500 consumer EV credit that's been really important in the US to any vehicle that had made in China components. So they had kind of already closed the car door, excuse the pun, on Chinese technology as well as vehicles. So Chinese vehicles, really, EVs weren't really being sold in the US as it was. And I think Biden's actions mean new ones now can't be. We haven't seen any talk of reversing that, and I don't think we will, although there might be some exceptions. I think we have to wait and see whether US EV sales slow as a result in the US of all of this. One thing I keep hearing from people, perhaps less worried about their popularity, is that the US needs competition from China in order to improve its own EV offerings. And they think that the US should take some pointers from China and up its game a little bit. And that it really needs consumers to buy the car they want, even if it's Chinese. So I think it's an interesting time. Obviously, US buyers and consumers are not going to be able to access Chinese cars. Who knows if there'll be some exemptions, but I don't think we're going to see them in the States. But it doesn't necessarily move the US auto industry further deeper into the electric vehicle sector.
Obviously, electric vehicles and battery metals are key to an energy transition to a lower carbon economy powered by low carbon renewables. The president has a lot of support for traditional energy sources such as oil and gas. And I'm curious, for the people you cover on your beat, what's kind of the mood? Is there the positive of the president seems to be backing more production of everything? Or are they worried that there's going to be a strong shift back towards traditional energy sources like oil and gas?
Well, as he kept saying, we heard a lot during the election campaign and before taking office, drill, baby, drill. So we knew the focus was going to be very much on oil and gas. And I think the initial work there will be focused on encouraging oil and gas exploration and production on federal lands and waters. It's interesting, there was a lot of mention of Alaska. Obviously, that's a really key area for natural gas and oil, but also a state with a considerable amount of minerals, including nickel and copper, which haven't been developed. It's home to the Red Dog mine, which is a very large zinc mine that Teck Resources, a Canadian company, operates. I did talk this week actually to some Alaskan companies with projects in Alaska who have been waiting to get those projects off the ground. And they're really, really positive. They do, however, point to logistical issues and environmental opposition and indigenous community factors to consider. And they do agree those things don't go away. But the governor of Alaska is actually a very strong ally of the president, and he is really keen to grow the state's wealth from natural resources and quickly. So I think you're going to start to see a similar approach adopted around the country, not in Alaska. Definitely the people I'm speaking to who are, in terms of the mining side and who have projects at least, they're optimistic that those projects are going to get a priority, especially if the US enters into a more kind of confrontational stance against some of its allies on the tariffs front.
There's a lot that we need to learn, and we're going to be figuring out as we go and the information comes in. But I was curious, are there certain events or actions that you're kind of gaming out and looking to as important signals or signposts that'll guide you and guide us on where the path might be going from here?
I'm thinking about it probably as I did during the first Trump administration, that anything can happen, and probably also to expect the unexpected. I do think the Ukraine war will be important because it could spell the end to sanctions in the US, although I'm not really sure that helps the US with oil dominance. If Russia resumes exports, we might see some tariffs there, but I do think that that will be very, very interesting. I think we also need to watch battery chemistries. I think with all of these changes, maybe we'll see more interest in sodium ion technology or solid state batteries to reduce reliance on imports of lithium iron phosphate cells for energy storage. Who knows? I think, again, will we see some of the mines that have faced permitting issues in the US suddenly get the green light? There are quite a lot of them that are in litigation or have been waiting for years and years and years. So maybe that happens. I think we still need to remember that those environmental and community issues remain, and lawsuits are probably the biggest obstacle there is to this immediate overnight change. I think what all of this does to financing for ESG is going to be really interesting. We're seeing lots of banks and investors pulling back in this area. And so we all know that it all comes down to money in the end, and financing can be a real obstacle. So I think that's really, really important. And I think maybe the biggest concern in the US is whether tariffs create inflationary pressures, and then worldwide, how trade wars impact global growth.
Peter Zaman, partner, HFW in Singapore.
I think the difficulty in this time trying to work out whether or not the withdrawal of the US from the Paris Agreement is more material than their first withdrawal is a bit more difficult. I think the first time they withdrew, people thought Trump coming to power was a one-off, never going to be repeated. We just have to get through 4 years and we'll have a Democrat administration, and then it will come back into the Paris Agreement and things will be like they were before. I don't know that you can take that view this time around. I mean, certainly we know that Trump is already withdrawing the US from the Paris Agreement, but I don't necessarily assume that at the end of his 4-year period, we won't get another Republican administration who is just going to keep it that way. So the chances of us saying that this is a one-off anomaly, I think, are rarer now. Now, if you go back to the Kyoto Protocol, the US didn't ratify the Kyoto Protocol. The US did not participate in the Kyoto Protocol. It had observer status throughout, and it never engaged. So the heavy lifting for any advancement of international carbon markets and therefore introducing carbon trading to the world fell upon the EU, Japan, and the rest of the world to basically carry forward the opportunities that the Kyoto Protocol presented. And I see ourselves pretty much in the same position this time around. And I think going forward, the reality is if the Paris Agreement is going to do its job, it'll have to do so without being able to count on the US. It seems to me that if you think about this rationally, if you think about it dispassionately, and you think about it logically, we do not have the time, and we do not have the will, and we do not have the money to achieve 1.5 degrees. Not without there being a massive shift in global support for achieving 1.5 degrees, which has to come from the private sector. And we have not seen the private sector engage as it should. And when it has engaged, we've seen ideological debates around what is an appropriate ton and how much environmental integrity should be attached to a ton versus not to a ton in the voluntary space being used to whip anybody who's trying to bring the private sector in. And we can turn to the role of the voluntary markets maybe a bit later on. But going back to your real question, which is what does the EU do? I'm afraid the EU has no choice. If the EU wants to continue with the Paris Agreement, and if it wants to support and reinforce global efforts, it's going to have to step up and take the lead like it did in the Kyoto Protocol. But it cannot do it from a position of unrealistic, unaffordable, ideological positions, which it then forces down other people's throats, which has generally speaking been its position up till now.
So I guess I'm curious, as we haven't been able to get carbon markets and carbon policy to move quickly enough, and if we're moving into a world where climate action is going to be slower and take longer to make meaningful change, does our path forward require a broader focus on managing climate risk and a broader build out of environmental markets that can help price adaptation, can help price weather-related damages? How do you think we need to be preparing for a world of increased climate risk?
We haven't focused on what we need to do. And because we haven't focused on what we need to do, we haven't applied ourselves to the fullest extent possible to determine solutions for financing adaptation, as an example. Now, in the mitigation space, like you say, we know how to price carbon today, but we don't have a universal price for carbon. And we have fragmented markets, we have illiquid markets. The price of carbon is sometimes considered a dirty word because it means that you're now asking your citizens to recognize the cost of the impact of their environmental footprint. And these are educational matters. These are matters of policy. These are matters of politics, because in an elected world, when you say to people that they're going to have to pay for the cost of their carbon footprint, they would rather not. I think the bigger interesting debate now is how does the Paris Agreement evolve itself to be useful for achieving whatever it is we can achieve, whether that's 2 degrees or maybe 1.5 degrees. And how is it we reinvent in a very positive, collaborative way this platform to achieve what we need to achieve, even in the adaptation space, better than it has been. It's the only tool we have. We abandoned the Kyoto Protocol in 2009. So the reality is we've got to live with the Paris Agreement, but we've got to reinvest in the Paris Agreement away and treat it differently in a more user-friendly way to enable it to be the tool to achieve both the adaptation growth side as well as the mitigation growth side. And we need to do both. We can no longer pretend that adaptation is less important than mitigation. The signs are there. We can't ignore it. We need to do more. But we can't just do it on the basis of public funding. We've got to use the leverages of the private sector to enable this to happen. And asking the voluntary sector to do it, I don't think is going to get us there. I think we're going to have to legislate it. And whether that's coming down from Paris Agreement or whether that's coming down at the country level or at the level of the EU as a bloc, I think it's going to have to be done. And if we don't do it and we don't do it rapidly, we are looking at a pretty dismal picture in the future.
Nobuo Tanaka, Executive Director Emeritus at the International Energy Agency. You've had a very long and distinguished career in energy, including serving as the Executive Director of the International Energy Agency. And I wanted to start off by asking you, it's been roughly 15 years since you were the Executive Director of the IEA. And I was curious how you've seen the energy landscape and energy policy concerns and conversation change over that period since you led the IEA.
The energy issues, when IEA was created after the first oil shock, it's about the petroleum. Petroleum supply stability is the heart of the energy security. So building the strategic stockpile for the member governments and sharing it in case of emergency, that was a mission of the IEA. But because of the shock we experienced by the supply disruption, the countries that prepared by reducing the oil consumption, by conservation or energy efficiency, and also moving away from oil to more using the natural gas, coal, and at the same time, nuclear power. And currently, one of the way to switch away from oil is using more the renewable energy sources, the modern renewables. So the energy has certainly contributed the global warming by emission of carbon dioxide. So that factor changed the energy policy dramatically. And the current recommendations or scenarios the IEA created went very, very much to the greener side of the energy perspective. So, yeah, in fact, because of the security issue is getting more serious after the geopolitical changes in the world. So the security issue is still very much of the concern of many of the world countries. But together with climate change mitigation, the challenge for the energy sector in IEA is getting very much complex.
Today, people often refer to energy policy and frame it in terms of the energy trilemma. So one more than a dilemma, I guess, describing that challenge that you mentioned of balancing those very important priorities of having energy be secure, affordable, and environmentally sustainable. And that mix really varies based on each part of the world. How would you characterize the state of the energy trilemma in both Japan and in Korea, which are, of course, large energy importers? Or how are these three competing priorities of security, affordability, and sustainability being weighed and balanced and prioritized in Japan and Korea today?
This is a very important question, David. And certainly Japan and Korea are very similar energy situation. We don't have natural resources at all. And at the same time, renewable energy sources very limited because of weather, because of the geographic situation. We suffer a lot of the challenges of energy security, as well as climate change mitigation, because it's very much of the challenge and how to reduce the cost for security, sustainability, and affordability. Another similarity between Korea and Japan is we are both the nuclear user, very peaceful nuclear user. So without nuclear power, energy security cannot be achieved. So Korea has developed many light water reactors. Japan did, but after Fukushima, certainly Korea is much more ahead of us of using nuclear power. So in a way, sustainability, yes, nuclear is the way to reduce carbon emission, limited use of renewables, and also the Japan, Korea using the liquefied natural gas together. I mean, natural gas is much cleaner than coal or oil as a fossil fuel. So, and supply is much more diversified because oil is very much concentrated to the Middle East or Russia. So natural gas is very much Australia. It can be Indonesia. It is much now in the United States typically. So it's very well diversified. So for the sake of security and sustainability, natural gas was a very important element for the Japanese diversity and sustainability. So Korea, Japan, and also Taiwan comes after as a major user of the liquefied natural gas. And we successfully commoditize it. But we have to do much, much more facing, as you mentioned, about the challenge between the geopolitical situation of the current global community. The US is moving more to the fossil fuel-based policy, like President Trump's drill, baby drill, is exactly the energy security policy of the US of using the much more affordable and plentiful fossil fuels, while China is the kind of opponent for this direction by using more and more renewable energy sources and nuclear. They try to reduce the use of fossil fuel. So this kind of geopolitical conflict of big super energy power. One is fossil fuel. Another one is more renewables and nuclear. What Japan and Korea should do? Should we go with US? Should we go with China and Europe? This is a big geopolitical choice for two countries to consider very seriously and to make our way out. I'm always saying there are winners and losers in this game of energy security and sustainability. Yes, for the sustainability sake, we need more renewables and nuclear. But for the security, we have to depend also on the natural gas in the foreseeable future. So we have to take very clever decision and making collaboration with different players together.
Halima Croft, Managing Director and Global Head of Commodity Strategy, RBC Capital Markets. Has the calculus for the U.S. changed, right? The U.S., huge oil exporter, huge oil producer, big gas. The U.S. really is a fossil fuel superpower right now on the global stage. Are U.S. interests tilting a little more towards somewhat higher prices would be in a national interest?
So this is such a great question because, again, in the early days of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, people who wanted very tough sanctions on Russia that would be commensurate with what we did with Iran. Remember, with Iran, we did put secondary sanctions on Iran, on energy exports of Iran, and we really drove down Iran's ability to sell into key markets. And people were saying at the time we should do something similar to Russia, that this US resource endowment gave the United States an opportunity to really sanction countries in a way that we couldn't do before. But again, we made the decision at the time not to go forward with very serious sanctions on Russia that would cause a supply disruption. I mean, again, I talked about all the institutions that were sanctioned, individual Russian banks, the central bank. Notice we never put secondary sanctions on Gazprom, on Rosneft, the major Russian energy companies. And the question is, has President Trump decided that now is the time to go forward with measures that would really potentially remove, if you look at India, they've ramped up to 1.7 million barrels a day of Russian energy imports. Like they were one of the big countries that took the supplies that were no longer going into Europe. Will India essentially become the target of a serious US effort to say, you must reduce your Russian imports? And again, that could have some significant impacts for prices right now. We're talking about fourth quarter that looks like it's going to be either amply supplied or significantly oversupplied. If we were to see a material drop in Russian exports, that could change the conversation about the fourth quarter in terms of prices. So again, does President Trump have the appetite to potentially deal with higher energy prices in the near term in order to send a signal to the Russians about the desire of the United States to bring this war to an end?
Are there certain signposts or actions you're looking to happen or not happen over the next few months?
I do think we really do have to watch what evolves on the sanctions policy from President Trump. Like, if we were to really signal a willingness to go after the Russian balance sheet, that could potentially change the calculations. If we think about Ukraine as well, like, what are we going to be providing in terms of military equipment? That to me is going to be very interesting in terms of like, what are the dynamics of the US when it comes to both sanctions and when it comes to weapon supplies? And then also when it comes to Europe. And I think bringing it back to energy beyond sanctions, I do think this deal that the United States and the EU just announced, this trade agreement with the 750 billion in purchases over 3 years of energy, undisclosed energy, and a lot of people are saying, "Oh my gosh, that's wildly ambitious." But if we say that we don't know how we're going to get to 750 billion, maybe that's again very ambitious. What we can say is we're anticipating more US LNG at a minimum will be going into Europe. And the question is a deal that essentially cements the loss of Russian market share. And you think about it, like, what are the US cargoes going to replace? They're going to replace likely the remaining Russian LNG imports into Europe. And so the question is, if you're Vladimir Putin and if you're looking at President Trump prioritizing US energy exports into your most important market, are you going to settle this war? Because one of the issues from the standpoint of the Russians is we all suspect that a key condition of at least freezing the conflict would be getting sanctions relief. And we do think that they're going to want access back to their most important market for energy. And so the question is, can you have a deal that ends the war in Ukraine while at the same time have these trade deals that essentially have the United States seizing basically for the foreseeable future that Russian market share? So I do think that's an interesting conversation about like these two deals, the trade deal and a deal to end the war. Are they potentially in conflict?
Then there's the issue of the tariffs, right? So we have this much wider use of tariffs, a lot of uncertainty, a lot of risk. We've seen it create wild moves in some commodity markets, like it recently has in copper. I'm curious, how do you see it affecting the energy markets, if at all?
If you think about beyond some of the situation of like, are we going to have potentially more oil than we need in the fourth quarter, which I think the biggest debate right now in the market is like what happens in Q4 with the oil picture. But a big macro worry has been a China slowdown because of tariffs. And that has just been since Tariff Liberation Day, like that has been a big headwind for oil, has been the concern about the overall macro impact of tariffs when it comes to demand. But then on the flip side, the use of secondary tariffs to target the exports of a key energy producer like Russia, that is the kind of flip side. There's the obvious bear case for tariffs, which is a demand hit. And then there's tariff as sanction, which is what we could be seeing with Russia, tariff as secondary sanction. That could be something, again, that could, at least in the near term, cause a drop in Russian exports to a key market, India. Again, I think it'll be harder to get China out of the Russia trade, but certainly I do think that India, if the United States was really serious about saying to India, we are going to demand that you make a significant reduction, and those refineries that do business with US regulated institutions could be in the crosshairs, I think you could see a significant drop in Indian imports of Russian oil.
Dave Ernsberger and Mark Aramo, co-presidents at S&P Global Commodity Insights.
What we saw clearly from the U.S. administration, especially back in spring as they were just coming into the office, at CERAWeek in Houston, where they had a platform to talk to people all over the world. The policy was around bringing all forms of energy that the market will support and tying in the more pragmatic approach to investments, not picking and choosing winners, but let the market and technology define which projects and which forms of energy will advance at the fastest pace. It was really, let's bring all forms of energy to the table, whether it be hydrocarbons, certainly renewables that make sense, where they make sense, and how they make sense. So it really was a discussion around portfolio. I'm sitting here in Cape Town at Africa Energy Week and listening to conversations between both US government officials or US represented companies and countries and policymakers in Africa who are having the same kinds of conversation about a pragmatic approach. So there's this balance, and again, not picking and choosing, but a sense bringing forward a pragmatic approach to the investments and letting the capital flow. To Dave Ernsberger's point, which was where there's clarity of policy, both from government and whether it be local or national, and where there's opportunity to get the financing and where you can see a return, that's where the capital is flowing right now.
And Dave, one of the themes that we've followed over the past year or more is that different countries' motivations for moving ahead on new sources of energy, renewable energy, is really driven by their local situation. So in the United States, because we have such a large endowment of oil and natural gas, often climate policies are seen as restrictive. Whereas in countries like India and China, it's a way to overcome deficiencies, get better energy security as they are more oil and gas poor. I was curious, when you're looking around the world and at China and India, how much do you see those types of concerns shaping the way they're investing in energy and the way they're investing in more sustainable energy forms?
David, those kinds of concerns are absolutely at the heart of why the three areas I pointed out, China, the Middle East, India, are all aggressively pursuing energy expansion strategies that have renewable energy at their heart in most cases and are a big part of their future. If we just take them in turn real briefly to sort of talk about why. China is the absolute classic paradigm of wanting to pursue an intensive self-sufficiency. I often tell people that China and the US are not really so different. Actually, that drive to be in energy independent, energy free is as close to the hearts of the Chinese population and policymakers as it is to anybody in the US. However, the pathway for China is profound electrification, the rapid deployment of an electric vehicle fleet into the auto force. The Middle East and India also show how when you marry a strategic imperative alongside a drive towards sustainable economic development, it's got double the chance of being successful. The Middle East is probably the most fascinating of all. The Middle East is hydrocarbon wealthy. Saudi Arabia is literally the Saudi Arabia of the oil market. And yet the push there is to build solar and renewable power to underpin what they hope will be a huge competitive opportunity to diversify the domestic economies into AI and data centers and to not sacrifice oil and gas exports along the way. Energy and electricity demand in the Middle East will probably double over the next 30 years or so. Currently, 70% of the electricity here is produced using natural gas. That wouldn't work in that sort of climate. So each of those areas has their own policy objective that sits alongside a sustainable economic development, and it's supercharging the outcome.
As we're having this conversation, you bringing up critical minerals and India stepping forward and looking to become an exporter and the US moving into new forms like hydrogen takes me, as often does, back to Dan Jurgen and the new energy map. And I was just kind of wanted to ask the two of you, it feels like the way we think about the world and who's producing what and who's consuming what is really in the process of changing in a fundamental way. And I was wondering, how do you think about that and how do you try to keep track of all of it?
Genuinely speaking, it's important to go deep on a multipolar scenario where actually there are very different mechanisms in play and different models that are actually very well progressed by now that are going to have different outcomes. And it is a case of spending the time, however one chooses to do it, to do the research. Because just like when the modern energy industry was being founded in the 1890s, tomorrow's energy industry is being founded in the 2020s. And nobody knows what the ultimate outcome is going to look like in the big picture. but it's going to be probably one of the iterations being formulated right now in one of the countries we've been talking about, or maybe a different one. And we didn't talk about the European Union. That's worth a whole episode on its own, quite frankly.
I'm going to slant my comments towards, I'll call it the downstream industries of refining, well, I'll say refining ags and chemicals in terms of, because I want to relate it to the changes that you talked about that are now starting to occur, whether they be geopolitical or macroeconomic. And I think that the way companies are thinking about a lot of these commodity markets is what is the role of China and how will China's role either change or modify as we look to the next 20 years. And from my perspective, there was a real pivot point. If you think back to 2000 through 2020, the amount of investment that went into China, they talked about roads and infrastructure going to nowhere, but it was phenomenal. And the way they build up a downstream processing industry that ultimately was feeding the manufacturing floor for the world was mind-boggling by any lens that you wanted to look at it. Both the capital that went in, the scale that they reached with these assets, the speed with which they built these industries was, again, nothing short of phenomenal. And it's gotten to a point where post-pandemic, where you have international trade relationships changing, and a lot of industries have to now pivot and say to themselves, a model of build low cost and export to high demand centers like China. So all of these investments that were going in, starting with competitive energy and making downstream products, and China having this huge consumption sink, being a net importer, as they become more self-sufficient in certain chains, it's causing a pivot. It's causing me to rethink whether it was plastics or whether it was refined products. I'm having to have a little bit different view of what that's going to mean going forward. So now I have to couple that with, again, what's happening on the energy front in terms of being competitive. How do I need to make sure that I am managing my carbon profile? Because I believe that low carbon products will become a market in and of themselves at some point in the future when that conversation becomes more at the forefront than maybe it has been with the recent pivots that have been going on. So I think the trade dynamics changing. So it really is a bit of a shift right now in terms of the world rebalancing itself and how you might think about from 2020 to 2040 versus 2020 looking backwards at 2000.
Renee Velasquez, Managing Partner, Valaterra.
Carbon markets are in a transition phase, and some say inflection point, and I think that they're the optimists, and I'll subscribe to that view. But certainly, it's never boring. And we see effectively a tale of two cities between compliance and voluntary markets. So that's the top level view. If you'll allow me to indulgence to kind of go down into a deeper dive. When we look at compliance markets, we see a growth in compliance markets. And just in terms of broad coverage, I lose count how many emissions trading systems now they are, but I believe somewhere close to, if not a quarter of the world's GDP is now covered with a carbon price. So I think that that's a really positive sign. And we're now starting to see more and more distribution of that signal with regards to pricing as a result of Article 6, in particular Article 6.2. So we're seeing the emergence effectively of systems at the member state level in order to now cover certain sectors and pass down these price signals across those various different sectors in line with their nationally determined contribution. We think that that will continue to grow. And parallel to that, I should also say that you've got other systems like Corsia that are starting to gain traction, and we start to see growth there as well. When I contrast that to voluntary carbon markets, that's a tale of two cities. Whether we see resilience and growth and kind of a steadfast direction, let's say with regards to compliance markets, voluntary markets have been very turbulent. I think that that's a fair statement to make, and obviously it's been well litigated and well discussed. But I do think that we're in an inflection point. Essentially, when we look back the last 18, 24 months, the voluntary carbon market has done a lot of reckoning, and quite rightly so for a lot of key and obvious reasons. But we've reckoned with this idea around integrity. And I think that is now mature enough, and we're starting to see the kind of the next phase, which is scaling. And what is lacking currently is a clear demand signal. And so we still need some items to align, most namely the tacit endorsement for companies to actually participate in the market. And that is in large part driven by, hopefully, adoption by bodies like the Science Based Targets Initiative and others of the importance of this tool that is carbon pricing. But I do think that during this this sort of downturn, the market has really reconciled a lot of the infrastructure, a lot of the systems, a lot of the clear transparency in imperatives and the integrity measures for the betterment of the market. That will translate over time into a much more robust market.
And I wanted to dig into the real world impact of being too extreme. Like you mentioned a few of them, like clearly if the major tech companies are choosing between investing in AI and pursuing it versus decarbonizing, right now AI is going to win.
They have a fiduciary obligation to their shareholders and stakeholders. They're not going to give up an opportunity that's worth potentially trillions of dollars. And that is one of the big tectonic shifts in recent memories. Like you're in my generation, right? We grew up in sort of at the beginning of that internet age, right? And it's been hugely beneficial and symmetry. Also depressionary with a lot of other things, right? In terms of pricing and kind of also providing this growth on global networks. The generation that my daughter is in, the generation Alpha folks versus our Gen X, they are growing up in real time in an AI environment. And that means that they can leverage these incredible tools to solve really complex problems like climate change. But there's a cost at which, that comes with the unlocking this very powerful tool set. And that's the energy piece. If the energy transition can actually go hand in hand with the growth in AI, and we see even further, more accelerated growth for renewables and battery storage and other forms of energy that don't result, for example, nuclear, that result with greenhouse gas emissions going to the atmosphere, then that's a good thing. If we don't use AI for, let's say, not so positive climate benefits like enhanced oil recovery tools, but we actually use them for helping to speed up technologies in the removal space, for example, then that can be good. But like any tools, it's who wields that tool that ultimately dictates what is the outcome.
The reason I asked you the prior question is because I think there are still a lot of young people, many being young people, or at least younger than you and I, who want to get involved in climate work, who want to get involved in carbon markets, carbon financing, project development. And I think that path has become less certain, more ambiguous, more difficult to access for many. So I was curious if you were to give advice for folks who now want to get involved, what would that advice be?
This is such a key area of passion for me. What I would say is focus on the problems that really resonate with you, that are either existential or that you think that you can provide value in terms of providing a solution for. Focus on solving those problems and you will find a very rewarding career path. Carbon markets, as per our conversation, we've highlighted at this really amazing inflection point. They're growing. They need greater participation, challenging new ideas, challenging the status quo. We need new blood. And some of that is disruptive, but some of that is really constructive. And I really think that because the young people, I'm talking, Gen Z and eventually Gen Alpha, they're the ones that inherit the world, right? After you and I are gone. Which may not be for a while, but ultimately they're the ones who inherit the planet next. And if ourselves, our generation, our predecessors have left it in a much warmer context, they have now a vested interest to try to rectify that solution. So come up with a solution, focus on that, help to accelerate the energy transition, help to accelerate the growth in carbon markets, help to whatever motivates you, make something and deliver something with change.
Mark Lewis, Partner and Managing Director, Climate Finance Partners, and former Head of Research at Onderon Capital.
The EU ETS is still very much the global benchmark compliance market, still the largest market, the most liquid, daily auctions, so pricing in real time with very decent liquidity, 35,000 to 40,000 lots traded every day on the EU ETS across the strip. And one other feature of it, of course, that I should have mentioned in that summary is it's the longest in existence. It's been going since 2005. We are now halfway through the lifetime of this market. It started in 2005. The cap is falling to zero by 2040. So this is a market that's been up and running for 20 years. And basically, it's only got another 15 years to go, at least as the legislation is currently written. We will see what happens. as these geopolitical pressures from Donald Trump kick in and tariffs potentially kick in. But right now, we're over the halfway mark in the lifetime of this market, and the rubber is about to hit the road in a big way, because a very, very key development next year, we have the CBAM, so-called CBAM carbon border adjustment mechanism, which is effectively a carbon tariff that the European Union will place on imports of goods covered by the scheme to ensure that European producers are not at a disadvantage in their own market from foreign producers of steel and cement and so on. And this is going to change, we think, market participants' behavior. And perhaps just to step back a little and explain to our audience the significance of this. I mean, this is a market that from day one, so from the 1st of January 2005, where price formation has been driven by the power sector, the power generation sector, right? They're the ones who've had to hedge forward and take carbon pricing into account when they're selling their power forward. It's essentially just another commodity like coal or gas that they're using for their power generation. They buy coal and they buy carbon. They buy gas and they buy carbon. And because they hedge forward typically, they sell their power on a rolling 3-year forward basis. That's why they have always been the main driver of prices. Now, of course, Europe is decarbonizing in the power sector very quickly. We have renewable energy capacity coming onto the system every year, and it is displacing the older fossil fuel generation capacity. That means in turn is we need the industrial sector to step up and start hedging their forward liabilities in the same way that the power sector in the past did, but in the future will not be doing, because they have less and less of a requirement to do that, because more and more of their generation collectively is coming from renewable sources. So I think this is an absolutely crucial moment in the development of the EU ETS, which will be watched very closely by other jurisdictions that have compliance markets, because the EU ETS, as we have known and loved it since its inception, is going to go through a big identity change as industrials step up to take over from utilities as the main driver of prices. Because what we're looking at now, between now and the end of this decade, and in fact all the way down to 2040 now, is annual deficits where demand is outstripping supply. So we should start to see prices move structurally higher over the next 5 years, between now and 2030, as we find that abatement price point for industry. What's the price at which industry can reduce emissions? That's where the price has to go. Now, is it 100, 150, 200? That's what the market will have to figure out over the next 2 to 3 years.
Maybe we could then also look at bringing in the Article 6 markets. So there's been a lot of focus there on that development, people looking at that being a new way, potentially bringing some more voluntary carbon market projects into the mix. I'm just curious, how do you see all this affecting the development of the Article 6 markets?
I think this is crucial, and I do think there is now an opportunity here. Europe realistically is going to have to lead the way on this, right? So they really have to find a way of squaring the circle, which is, and when I say squaring the circle, I mean, how do you ensure that European industry remains competitive when energy prices are already much higher than they are in much of the rest of the world, and certainly a lot higher than they are in the United States and North America generally? How do you avoid putting even more competitive pressure on European industry, whilst at the same time ensuring the carbon price is high enough to send a price signal that decarbonizes industry without forcing industry out of Europe? That's the stark choice. That's the circle that has to be squared. And in particular, that debate, which is coming, I believe, in probably 2026, because in 2026, there's a review of a number of features of the EU ETS, and very much on the table will be the question of what kinds of offsets or removals will be allowed into the EU ETS beyond 2030, because from 2030 onwards, the cap is declining in linear fashion to hit zero by 2040. And today, in 2025, the cap is around 1.1 billion. So we're going from 1.1 billion tons of allowed emissions to 0 tons of allowed emissions. People often forget, whilst the EU headline target is a net zero target, the EU ETS falls to zero in absolute terms, in terms of the cap, by 2040. This is an absolute zero, as it is written at the moment. Now, I don't think that's going to be possible to retain. So, to me, the obvious solution is to allow credits that can be generated at scale and credits that are compatible with the accounting framework of the UNFCCC's Paris Agreement into the EU ETS beyond 2030. And we can debate the volumes and how much of the abatement that needs to happen should happen domestically and how much should be offset via the use of Article 6 credits with corresponding adjustments. But in my view, I'm not aware of any other instrument that is going to be scalable and that will have, by definition, the environmental integrity that will allow Europe to say, yes, we're allowing offsets in, but the fact that the only offsets allowed in are Article 6 credits with corresponding adjustments, and that means that if we're buying from Brazil or Mexico or India or whoever, they are having to reduce their emissions further so that they comply with their Paris obligations, then it's a win-win. You're reducing the overall cost of compliance in Europe whilst ensuring the global agreement on emissions reductions through the Paris Agreement is respected. Now, that's how I think in an ideal world, Europe should approach the question of Article 6.
Hannah Howman, Global Head of Carbon Trading at Trafigura.
So as we're really looking at the landscape going forward within Article 6, and actually something you and I have talked about before is this concept of we are creating kind of the first real global carbon market, not in the form of everything's homogenous and everything's the same, but that everything's standardized and that you actually have the ability to have differentiated preferences on top of a standardized framework. So that Article 6 rulebook that's now being developed means that we now actually have centralized registries, we have defined methodologies or project types that are eligible compliance grade for international trade, and then also kind of the rule book for what countries need to do in terms of participating, either on the buy side or on the export side. So when we think about quality and how we kind of define that new definition of investment grade, we see a lot of the same hallmarks as we did before. So things like, what is the actual operational quality? Does it deliver when it should? How much it should, and on the timing that it should. So all of those things still exist, as these are still underlying physical assets behind the credits. But the new, let's say, variable that we've put into play is now export grade or export quality, which within an Article 6 context just means the exporting country has not only given approvals for the project, but has also issued a corresponding adjustment or export approval for that credit to now be traded and now be legal tender within Paris Agreement balances. So that is an entirely new paradigm that the market is now grappling with. It is less infrastructure based, so not so much reliant on digital tools or methodologies, but very much policy based, as now you're needing countries to decide from an exporting basis, what types of activities do they want to export? What are the appropriate export fees? How does that change over time? Do they want to have a subset which is whitelisted for domestic, a subset for international, so on and so forth? And all we're kind of doing is putting additional policy layers on top to enable this global trade. But in truth, it's not that dissimilar to what we see on every other commodity. So we have some playbooks to pull from, but that's, I think, really how we're changing the definition of what investment grade is we've now added this additional criteria on, does it have export approvals, and is it now legal tender under Article 6?
Well, I'd like to turn now towards something you've been referring to, and you're speaking to this on your panel tomorrow, which is that we're seeing many national and regional compliance schemes, compliance markets developing and ramping up around the world. And what do you believe are the most important developments that people should be watching? Like, what are the big macro themes that you're following?
It's pretty incredible at the moment. I'm sure I've said this in the past, but I think the headlines are almost a challenge to keep up with, frankly, because of the pace and the frequency of iteration that we see. And it's not really any one single market. It's kind of everywhere all at once at the moment. So to kind of boil that up to the macro themes that we're seeing, I think one is a general growth for the first time in the last few years of true compliance demand. So we're all used to seeing these charts that say X amount of GHG emissions under carbon pricing, and nominally that looks like it increases every year. The reality has been that actually free allocations under the schemes means that your net demand or your real compliance coverage has actually been pretty stagnant for really the last 4 years. And I think this was a bit of the whiplash that the market had when we're preparing for all this growth, and actually governments weren't necessarily tightening the schemes in the way that everyone intended. That is now changing. So as we look into next year, what we're now seeing is for the first time a very real lift in things like reduction of those free allocations, which is overall increasing the total compliance demand. The second piece of this, I would say, is beyond, I would say, just existing markets that are now having kind of new levers and tightening. We're seeing on a widespread scale the incorporation of credits within the regulatory design. So in some instances, that is domestic only. So again, I'll use Europe as an example. Historically, Europe's been against credits within the compliance scheme, but is now unveiling the EU CRCF, which is now deeming removal specifications with the intention to bring it in from post-2030. Other jurisdictions are incorporating it into the regulatory markets for imports. So markets like Korea, markets like Japan, that are actually leveraging Article 6 to be able to pull in those Article 6 credits via the domestic regulatory scheme. So I think those two things we see is kind of the big trajectories coming. One being just a generally larger market in the terms of net demand, and governments getting more comfortable going up those next layers. And the second is the concept of credits, and specifically domestic or internationally traded credits, really at the core of each of these designs.
And so as we move into this world where the emphasis and the focus seems to be much more about the climate action that countries are taking rather than corporations, I kind of wanted to get your sense of how countries are thinking about their climate action. And in particular, when we think about framing of environmental goals, like what are the main factors shaping different countries' ambitions and their NDCs?
We saw it a lot with companies, but especially countries, on what does this do reputationally? How am I making a name for myself? How am I stepping forward? So again, much more offensive and framed a little bit more within the frame of philanthropy. That has changed really substantially to be one that is now much more about energy security or energy independence, much more about trade relations. There's a little bit going on in the world right now about cross-border trade in particular, for example. So if you actually look, each country is slightly different in terms of their focus, but it's not about necessarily doing good things. It's about how they are protecting their long-term competitiveness of their countries and their economies. So for example, yesterday I was listening to the state legislature of California talking primarily about air quality. And yes, CO2 reductions is obviously also a core pillar of this, but what their citizens experience every single day is actually the air quality difference of when they're able to reduce emissions. If you speak to other players in Europe, for example, it's very much about energy independence and how are they building out renewable capacity so that they are not reliant on foreign fossil fuel imports. If you travel elsewhere in the world, in New Zealand, they will talk a lot about erosion. So a lot of their carbon pricing and carbon scheme relies on actually afforestation and creation of new forests to really just protect the island from desertification and erosion of the natural environment. So again, every government has slightly different kind of views of how they're pursuing this, but pretty much every single one is focused on self-interest, on how do I ensure affordability for my citizens? How do I reduce things like insurance damage, which is becoming an increasingly hot topic? And then on the international side of things, how do I improve those trading relationships in a multipolar world? How am I strengthening those key corridors with those nations I'm already working with in order to reduce my overall mitigation cost? So again, I would say highly varied, but with some very core centralized themes there.
Teresa Kammel and Pierre Busson, originator and senior structurer, Weather and Agro, Zurich at Munich Re.
I'm in the energy sector, so quite some years starting kind of counting. And actually, I didn't come directly to the energy trading floor. I actually spent the first few years as advisor for government and large corporates in energy and climate negotiations. So I really started working on supply side risk in big international meetings, also working during COP15 and COP16 with governments on energy transitions, carbon markets, all these type of elements, really mostly carbon policies and energy transition. And this is why I started seeing that market, the energy segment in general, is massively changing. There are tremendous changes. It's about new regulations. It's about new technologies. It's about really kind of market designs, etc. And when I was working on a trading floor in a large power utility in Europe, I was always been very surprised to which extent kind of the volume weather risk was underestimated. And this is why I thought that to some extent, kind of weather derivative is one part of the equation. It's one thing that is trying to put a price on the weather availability. And this is what actually brought me to the world of weather derivative, trying to kind of say, okay, that's where I believe that kind of we can bring financial expertise, we can bridge energy knowledge, and at the end, still helping people to deliver energy from a supply side to a demand side.
And let me come back to you, Teresa. Now, I think climate change has made all of us aware of the increase in weather-related risks, the volatility of the weather. But I think most people are unaware of the increasingly sophisticated ways they can manage that risk. Listening to Pierre, there's a lot of tools that have been brought over from the other financial markets, a lot of data that can be brought to bear. And I wanted to ask you, as you work with clients, how aware are they of the level of sophistication with which they can manage weather-related risk now? And how do you help educate clients about these tools that are available to them?
Yes, David. So I think it's absolutely true that the general awareness of like weather and climate related risks has increased over the past years in the general public. If we look specifically at our client base, I think you can like divide them up into almost two camps. On the one side, we have like really sophisticated clients. And on the other side, we have very like big players, but they're not fully aware yet of what their weather risks are. But let's look first at the sophisticated clients. You can think of like big utilities or big hedge funds. They have dedicated weather teams, or at least weather traders, and with a specific mandate to always be on top of these risks, how the weather is evolving, how they might have to adjust their positions. And with those clients, they know exactly what they want. With them, it's more sort of a collaboration where we work over various months on like complex structures, as Pierre pointed out, and that's where he usually comes in. He's the go-to structure for these kind of deals. Like we work very closely on these structures to come up with a customized solution that actually like perfectly fits the client's exposure. And that's also so where weather derivatives is this great tool to be really creative, because you can structure them in very creative ways. If you look more into the second category, like the unaware but established players, there is a different game. So we try and go and understand what are these risks, what tools are available, and then try and work until we maybe come to a deal. And that often would take like a year or 2 years. It's not a very fast process. And it's certainly not a one-off conversation.
I find your question very interesting and actually trigger a thought here, because you said kind of that obviously a power utility involved in a power generation from renewable asset should be fully aware of that risk and should be active in that segment. I find it a very interesting comment. And of course, that may sound obvious to everybody listening to that podcast that, okay, that's you're aware of that risk. But actually what we are saying is there are some players very active there and very aware of that. Some others, they thought it's part of their DNA to have to wear out that risk. It's almost like I'm building a wind farm, for example, there will be years or months with less wind, more wind, and it's the natural uncertainty of the business, and I have to deal with it. And actually, it's not true. They do not have to necessarily fully carry the burden by themselves. They can actually share it. They can find a way of actually mitigating it. And I still find it very funny that when you discuss sometimes with even very large utilities, you have those who are extremely aware and some other people that say, I have to take that risk. It's in my natural obligation. I'm active in that segment, therefore I have to carry that risk. No, it's not true. You can actually hedge it as you would hedge as you are hedging yourself against commodity prices, against FX rate, against other type of risk that And you're doing that every day. Why do you think it's not the case for the weather? And when you ask that questions, very often people say, I don't know. It's just that I thought it was in my mindset.
Right. It's the old thing, right? Everybody talks about the weather and no one does anything about it. How big are these weather related risks? If you put a dollar or euro or Swiss franc number to it, like how big financially are the risks that many of your clients are facing?
In Europe, we faced over Q1 in 2025 a massive, so the first quarter of 2025, a massive wind drought. So if we look at the different countries and different markets, wind was between 20 and 30% lower than average. It had a massive impact. And I look at, for example, Germany, and Germany was a 20-ish percent below the, let's say, an average wind performance for the assets. And then if you take that number and you multiply with current forward prices on the market, that basically those 20% of missed opportunity in terms of production that represents 750 million euro in terms of missed opportunity. So you're not very far from a 1 billion. And we're talking about Germany in one quarter. So indeed, we're talking at, if you just do that on all the geographies, and if you do that for the different markets, wind, solar, hydro, the temperature on the demand side of things, we're talking big numbers here.
We hope you enjoyed the first half of our 2025 holiday special, the Year in Review. We'll continue looking back to the big themes of the year next week in part 2 of our holiday special 2025. We hope you'll join us.
This episode is brought to you in part by Abaxx Exchange, bringing better price discovery and risk management tools to navigate today's commodities markets through centrally cleared, physically deliverable futures contracts in energy, environmental, battery materials, and precious metals markets. Smarter Markets are here. Contact sales at abaxx.exchange to get started. That concludes this week's episode of Smarter Markets by Abaxx. For episode transcripts and additional episode information, including research, editorial, and video content, please visit smartermarkets.media. Please help more people discover the podcast by leaving a review on Apple Podcast, Spotify, YouTube, or your favorite podcast platform. Smarter Markets is presented for informational and entertainment purposes only. The information presented on Smarter Markets should not be construed as investment advice. Always consult a licensed investment professional before making investment decisions. The views and opinions expressed on Smarter Markets are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect those of the show's hosts or producer. Smarter Markets, its hosts, guests, employees, and producer, Abaxx Technologies, shall not be held liable for losses resulting from investment decisions based on informational viewpoints presented on Smarter Markets. Thank you for listening, and please join us again next week.